The first sign of trouble wasn't the smoke, but the silence. A profound, unnatural quiet fell over the high country, a silence so deep it seemed to swallow the very wind. On his remote ranch, Silas McKenna felt it in his bones. He paused, his hand resting on the warm, familiar flank of his old horse, Odin, and scanned the vast, empty grasslands that stretched to the jagged teeth of the mountains. The birds had stopped singing. The usual rustle of unseen things in the tall grass had ceased. It was the kind of pregnant hush that precedes a predator's strike dot at 43. His weathered face bore the deep lines of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little about it. His boots echoed hollow against the wooden boardwalk of cedar. Ridge's main street as he made his way toward Henderson's general store, each step measured, deliberate, as if he were crossing a minefield. The silence of his ranch was a comfort. The silence that fell when he entered town was a condemnation. The whispers started before he even reached the store's front steps, a venomous hiss that followed him like a cloud of flies. "There goes the yellow belly," came a voice from the barber shop, just loud enough to be heard, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. "Coward," hissed Mrs. Clemens from behind her pristine lace curtains, the word carrying on the morning breeze like a curse. Children playing marbles in the dust scrambled to their feet and pointed, their faces a mixture of fear and cruel fascination. "Traitor," one of them called out, echoing words they'd heard from their parents 1,000 times. Their laughter was sharp and piercing, the kind only children could produce. When they sensed a weakness sanctioned by their elders, Silas's jaw tightened imperceptibly, a barely visible ripple in the sun-cured leather of his skin, but he didn't quicken his pace or alter his course. He'd learned long ago, in the brutal crucible of war and its even more brutal aftermath, that reacting only fed the fire. Instead, he pushed through the store's front door, the bell chiming his arrival with an almost apologetic tone, as if sorry to have disturbed the peace. The low hum of conversation inside ceased immediately, cut off as if by a knife. Tom Henderson, the portly store owner, looked up from his ledger, his spectacles perched on his nose. His expression soured, his jowls tightening with barely concealed distaste. Two other customers ranchers from neighboring spreads named Hanson and Cole suddenly found their boot leather fascinating to examine, their heads bent in feigned concentration. "McCunna," Henderson said, the name dropping from his lips like something distasteful he'd found in his coffee. "What do you need?" "Coffee, beans, salt," Silas replied, his voice a low rumble that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep in his chest, a sound rarely used and rusty from disuse. "Usual supplies." Henderson nodded curtly and began gathering the items with unnecessary force, slamming cans down on the warm wooden counter. "That'll be $8.40. It was highway robbery, nearly double the fair price, but it was a tax Silas had paid for 8 years. The price of being tolerated. He counted out the money without protest, his large, calloused hands moving with a slow, deliberate grace. The other customers watched him with a morbid fascination, usually reserved for dangerous animals in cages or the condemned man on his way to the gallows. "Hear tell there's been some cattle rustling up north," Hanson said, finally looking up. His tone was loaded, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Sheriff Brody's been asking questions about men who might have learned unconventional skills during the war. Men who know how to move quiet-like." The implication hung in the air, like smoke. Silas met the man's gaze steadily, his own eyes clear and unwavering. "My cattle are all accounted for, Hanson." "Course they are," Hanson replied with a cold smile. "A man who runs from a fight probably runs from everything else, too." The silence that followed was deafening, thick with tension. Henderson's hand moved unconsciously toward the greener shotgun he kept behind the counter. The other customer, Cole, took a half step back, wanting no part of whatever was about to happen. Even after all these years, there was something about Silas McCunna, a coiled stillness, a deep and dangerous calm that made men nervous, despite or perhaps because of his reputation. Silas finished bagging his supplies with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else. "Good day, gentlemen." Outside, the whispers followed him like a pack of hunting dogs. He loaded his supplies into the back of his wagon, where his horse waited with the patience of old friendship. Odin was a magnificent animal, standing 17, hands high with a coat the color of burnished copper. Most folks in town assumed he was just another ranch horse, but they couldn't see what Silas saw, the way Odin's ears swiveled independently, constantly monitoring for threats, the manner in which he positioned himself to provide the best escape route, the subtle, indelible signs of a mount trained for war. "Come on, old friend," Silas murmured, running his hand along the horse's powerful neck. "Let's go home." The ride back to his spread took him through the heart of Cedar Ridge's residential district, past white-painted houses with neat gardens and American flags hanging from porches. This was Founder's Day weekend, and the preparations were evident. Everywhere, bunting stretched between buildings, a platform erected in the town square for speeches about civic duty and military valor. The irony wasn't lost on him. It was a festival celebrating the very ideals he was accused of betraying. At the edge of town, where the houses gave way to open range, Silas encountered Sheriff Brody astride his black gelding. The lawman was a bear of a man with graying hair and a badge that seemed to catch every ray of sunlight, amplifying his authority. He pulled up alongside Silas's wagon, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "McKenna, Sheriff, you planning on attending tomorrow's festivities?" It was less a question than a warning. Silas met the sheriff's steely gaze without flinching. "Wasn't planning on it? Good. Folks get emotional on patriotic holidays. Might be uncomfortable for someone with your particular history." The words stung more than Silas cared to admit, but he kept his expression neutral. "I'll keep that in mind." Sheriff Brody studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read some hidden message in his weathered features. "You know, McKenna, I've never quite figured you out. Most cowards don't have the sand to look a man in the eye the way you do. Maybe you don't know as much about cowards as you think you do, Sheriff." Something flickered in Brody's eye, surprise, perhaps, or a flicker of uncertainty. But it passed quickly, replaced by the familiar mask of authority and disdain. "Maybe, but I know enough about deserters." He spurred his horse and rode away, leaving Silas alone with his thoughts and the weight of old accusations. The McKenna spread lay 7 miles outside of town, a modest operation carved from harsh country through years of backbreaking work. The ranch house was small but well maintained, built from local stone with a wide porch that faced west toward the mountains. A barn, corrals, and a few outbuildings completed the picture of a man making an honest living from unforgiving land. Silas unhitched Odin and led him to the barn, taking time to brush the dust from his coat and check his hooves. These quiet moments with his horse were often the best part of his day. No judgmental stares, no whispered accusations, just the comfortable companionship of a fellow survivor. "They don't understand, do they, old boy?" he said softly, running. The brush along Odin's flanks. "They see desertion and think cowardice. They don't know about Chancellorsville." The horse nickered softly, as if he understood. In many ways, Silas suspected he did. Odin had been there that terrible day, had seen what Silas had seen, had shared in the horror that changed everything. The memories came unbidden, as they always did when his guard was down. The 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry, charging through the Virginia wilderness. The Confederate position that was supposed to be lightly defended. The trap that snapped shut around them like the jaws of some hellish beast. And then ... Silas shook his head, pushing the images away. Some memories were too heavy to carry in. The daylight. He finished with Odin and made his way to the house, where a simple supper and a bottle of whiskey waited to help him forget. But forgetting was a luxury he'd never been able to afford. Not when the ghosts of Chancellorsville visited him every night in his dreams. That night, as he had every night for the past 8 years, Silas McKenna sat on his porch with a glass of whiskey and watched the sun die behind the mountains. The amber liquid caught the last rays of light, creating a small fire in his glass that he contemplated like a prophet reading omens. The silence of the high country was different from the silence in town. Here, it was clean and honest, broken only by the distant call of a coyote or the soft whisper of wind through the grass. Odin stood in the near pasture, his head raised, ears forward. Even in retirement, the old warhorse maintained his vigilance. Whiskey burned its familiar path down his throat, but it couldn't burn away the memories that rose with the darkness. Chancellorsville, May 2nd, 1863. The day that changed everything. Lieutenant Silas McKenna. 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry had been a different man then. Young, eager, burning with righteous purpose. He'd enlisted the day after Fort Sumter, convinced the war would be over by Christmas. 3 years later, the boy who'd signed up had died, somewhere between Bull Run and Gettysburg, replaced by a hard-eyed veteran who'd seen too much death and too little glory. The mission should have been simple reconnaissance, but intelligence was wrong. Colonel Harrison, a political appointee more concerned with headlines than horse sense, had driven them forward into a trap. The Confederate cavalry under J.E.B. Stuart had hit them from 3 sides at once. In the space of 10 minutes, the 7th Pennsylvania ceased to exist as a fighting unit. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came after. Wounded Confederates had been scattered throughout the woods, some so young they looked like children playing dress-up. Colonel Harrison ordered them taken as prisoners. Then came the order that changed everything. No prisoners, Harrison had said, his voice flat and cold. We can't spare the men to guard them. Sir, these men are wounded. Lieutenant McKenna had stared at his superior officer in disbelief. They're no threat. They're rebels, Lieutenant. And rebels have a way of healing up and shooting good Union boys. I won't have their blood on my hands. Now carry out your orders. Silas had looked at the wounded boys, because that's what they were, boys barely old enough to shave, and seen his younger brother Thomas in their faces. Thomas, who died at Antietam. I can't do it, sir. That's a direct order, Lieutenant. Then court-martial me, sir, but I won't murder wounded boys. The standoff lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Finally, Harrison had drawn his sidearm. If you won't do your duty, McKenna, I'll find someone who will. That's when Silas had made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He'd mounted Odin, turned his back on the 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry, and ridden away. Behind him, he'd heard the gunshots, 11 of them, one for each wounded Confederate. He'd never looked back. The whiskey glass was empty. He'd saved his own soul that day, but at the cost of everything else. The town that called him a coward didn't know he'd risked execution to refuse a war crime. But explanations were just excuses, and excuses wouldn't bring back the 11 boys who died because he hadn't been strong enough to find another way. Tomorrow would be Founder's Day. He'd wake and tend his cattle, and fix his fences and pretend that the whispers didn't cut like knives. It was the life he'd chosen. Founder's Day dawned clear and bright. From his porch, Silas could see the distant smoke rising from Cedar Ridge's chimneys. He'd been specifically invited not to attend, which was fine by him. Better to spend the day mending fences. Odin seemed to sense his mood, staying close to the house. The horse had always been unusually perceptive, a skill that had kept them both alive during the war. By mid-morning, Silas was working on a stretch of fence line that bordered the main road. The first sign that something was wrong came from Odin. The horse lifted his head from the grass, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. A moment later, Silas heard it too, the thunder of hoofbeats coming fast. A rider appeared, pushing his lathered mount hard. It was young Billy Henderson, Tom's son, his face white with terror. Mr. McKenna. Billy gasped, his voice high and tight with panic. You got to help. They took the town. Silas straightened slowly, his hammer still in his hand. Who took the town, Billy? Outlaws. But not regular ones. They move like soldiers, Mr. McKenna. They rode in during the ceremony, maybe 20 of them, all in a line like cavalry. They had the sheriff down before he could draw his gun, and they took hostages. Pa sent me to get help, but there ain't nowhere to go 'cept here. The boy's words hit Silas like physical blows. 20 men, moving with military precision. A classic, tactical approach. Tell me exactly what you saw, Billy. Billy's story was terrifyingly clear. A disciplined force had struck Cedar Ridge with surgical precision, seizing key locations, cutting telegraph lines, and taking the town's leaders hostage in the church. Their leader, Billy continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, he's got these cold eyes, Mr. McKenna, like he's looking right through you. And when Sheriff Brody tried to fight back, this man just looked at him, didn't even raise his voice. Just looked, and the sheriff went down like he'd been poleaxed. Silas felt a chill. He'd known men like that during the war. What do they want, Billy? Money, I think. Pa said they're waiting for the army payroll that's supposed to come through on Monday. The pieces fell into place. The army payroll was a quarterly delivery, enough gold to pay 3 regiments. Billy, ride to the Jameson spread, then on to the Morrison place. Tell them what's happened and have them send riders to Fort Collins. The army needs to know their payroll shipment is compromised. Billy nodded eagerly, then hesitated. What about you, Mr. McKenna? What are you going to do? It was a good question. The smart thing would be to disappear into the high country. He owed nothing to the town that had made him an outcast. But as he looked at Billy Henderson's terrified face, he saw a frightened boy who'd ridden 7 miles to ask for help from the one man everyone else had ridden off. He saw faith, misplaced perhaps, but real. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he heard 11 gunshots echoing through a Virginia forest. Billy, he said quietly, you tell those folks that help is coming. You tell them to hold on and be brave. The boy's face lit up with hope. You're going to save them, Mr. McKenna? Silas looked at Odin, who was watching him with intelligent brown eyes. The horse nickered softly, as if he understood. We're going to try, son. After Billy rode away, Silas stood for a long time, wrestling with the decision that would define the rest of his life. He could still change his mind. No one would blame him. Most folks would expect it from the coward of Cedar Ridge. But as the afternoon shadows grew longer, he found himself walking toward the barn where he kept his war gear. It had been 8 years since he'd opened that trunk, but his hands remembered what his mind tried to forget. The Colt Army revolver, cleaned and oiled. The Spencer repeating rifle. The cavalry saber. And most importantly, the tactical gear that marked the difference between a common soldier and a scout, field glasses, maps, compass, and the specialized tack that would allow man and horse to move as one silent shadow. Odin watched from his stall, his demeanor growing more alert. When Silas finally approached with the war bridle, Odin's ears pricked forward with something that might have been excitement. You remember, don't you, old friend? Silas murmured as he adjusted the straps. You remember what we used to be. The horse tossed his head, 8 years of peaceful retirement falling away. As the sun began to set, Silas McKenna prepared to ride back into a war he'd thought was finished. But this time, he wouldn't be riding away from his conscience. This time, he'd be riding toward redemption. The moon was a thin silver crescent when Silas reached the outskirts of Cedar Ridge. From the ridge overlooking the town, he could see the layout clearly through his field glasses. The outlaws had positioned themselves with military precision, sentries at every approach, guards on the rooftops, a command post in the hotel. This was a military operation. He counted at least 80 men. Through the glasses, he studied their leader, the man Billy had described. Colonel Thorne, Silas decided. The name fit. Silas lowered the glasses. A frontal assault was out of the question. That left only one option: guerrilla warfare. He'd have to become a ghost. Moving with fluid silence, Silas led Odin down from the ridge through a dry wash. At the edge of town, he left Odin hidden in a grove of cottonwoods. Then Silas McKenna became what he'd been during the war, a shadow with eyes, moving through enemy territory. Cedar Ridge after dark was a different world. The familiar streets felt alien, transformed by armed men who moved with the confidence of conquerors. Silas counted them: 2 guards at the train station, 3 patrolling Main Street, a sniper in the church bell tower. They were watching for external threats, not for a single man who knew every alley and building in town. The hotel where Thorne had his headquarters was his target. He studied the alley, timing the guards' patrol patterns. There a drain pipe, running up the north wall, and a dark window on the 2nd floor. Moving like liquid darkness, he crossed the street and began to climb. Halfway up, a guard rounded the corner below. Silas froze, pressing himself against the wall. The sentry walked directly beneath him, but never looked up. The 2nd floor. Window was unlocked. He slipped inside an empty guest room. Through the thin walls, he could hear voices. Trains due at 10:30 Monday morning. 15 minutes to get the strong boxes loaded. ... What about the hostages? A younger, uncertain voice. What about them? The first voice, cold and dismissive. They served their purpose. Once we have the gold, they become a liability. No, Lieutenant Morrison. Dead witnesses tell no tales. Silas felt his blood turn to ice. They were planning to eliminate witnesses. A floorboard creaked beneath his boot. The conversation stopped. What was that? Footsteps. Morrison, check the next room. Silas was already moving, but the door burst open and Morrison stepped inside, gun drawn. For a moment, the 2 men stared at each other. Morrison was young, but his hand was steady. Don't move, he said. You heard, Silas said. It wasn't a question. Morrison's gun wavered. Heard what? What your colonel plans to do to those people. To the children. Orders are orders, Morrison replied, but there was no conviction in his voice. Are they? Even when they turn you into a child killer? The young man's face went pale. You don't understand. The colonel. He's not a man you disobey. I understand better than you think, son. I've been where you are. The question is, what kind of man do you want to be when the sun comes up? Then Colonel Thorne's voice cut through the darkness. Morrison, report. The spell was broken. In here, Colonel. We have an intruder. As Thorne appeared in the doorway, Silas stepped into the moonlight. Colonel Thorne, he said calmly, I believe we need to talk. The Confederate officer studied him with eyes like chips of winter ice. Silas McKenna, Thorne said. The famous deserter of Cedar Ridge. I was wondering when you'd show up. Colonel Thorne radiated a cold, calculating authority. Lieutenant Morrison, lower your weapon, he commanded. Mr. McKenna didn't come here to fight. If he had, we'd have started dying an hour ago. Reluctantly, Morrison holstered his gun. You know who I am, Silas said. I know exactly who you are, McKenna, the ghost of Chancellorsville. I also know why you ran. The words hit Silas like a physical blow. You were there. I was the captain commanding those wounded boys your Colonel Harrison murdered. Thorne replied, his voice a low whisper. I woke up in time to watch a Union officer turn his back on an order to execute prisoners of war. The man Cedar Ridge calls a coward is the only person in this affair who's ever shown real courage. The revelation should have brought relief, but instead it brought more questions. If you know ... then why? Why take the town? Why threaten innocent people? Because, Thorne spun around, his composure cracking, sometimes the only way to get justice is to take it yourself. Those boys were barely old enough to shave, McKenna. Your precious Union Army executed them like cattle. And you ask me about justification? So this is revenge. This is education, Thorne corrected. The good people of Cedar Ridge worship military virtue. They call you a coward while they cheer for men like Harrison. Well, now they're going to learn what real soldiers are capable of when the gloves come off. And yes, I'm going to take enough gold to ensure my men can disappear into Mexico and live like kings. You survived the war, but you never came home from it, Silas said. You've been fighting it ever since. But meaning isn't something you can steal or kill your way to, Colonel. Thorne's mask of professionalism slipped back into place. The plan proceeds. The train arrives. We take the gold. We eliminate the witnesses. Nothing you can say or do will change that. Let the hostages go, Silas offered. Take me instead. Thorne shook his head. A generous offer, but pointless. This is about making a statement that will echo from here to Washington. And you're willing to murder children to make that statement? I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Silas looked at Morrison, who was staring at his boots as if watching his soul die. What about you, Lieutenant? The lieutenant follows orders. Thorne said firmly. I've seen what you call necessity, Silas said, his voice laced with contempt. I've watched good men become monsters in the name of duty. That's not leadership, that's cowardice. Thorne's hand moved to his sidearm. You're trying my patience, McKenna. Then I guess we'll see which one of us is the better soldier, Silas said, swinging his leg over the windowsill and dropping into the alley below. Dawn was still hours away, but he had work to do. He would become a ghost again, and this time he would hunt Dot moving through the sleeping town. Silas began his war. The first target was the sniper in the church bell tower. He climbed the maintenance ladder on the outside wall, a shadow against the stone. The sniper was young, a boy playing soldier. For a heartbeat, Silas hesitated. Then he thought of the children in the church below. The knife flew true. One down. He took the dead man's rifle and position. An hour later, a street patrol passed below. A single shot echoed through the town. Chaos erupted as Thorne's men realized they were under attack. Silas was already gone, melting into the alleys he knew from childhood. He struck again at the bank, then again at the edge of town, a whisper of death that frayed the nerves of Thorne's veterans. From the hotel, Thorne tried to restore order. Maintain your positions. He's just one man, pairs only. Nobody moves alone. It was good tactical thinking, but it came too late. The psychological damage was done. Thorne's men were no longer hunters, but the hunted Dot as he moved, Silas heard. A child crying inside the church. The sound, muffled but clear, reminded him of what was at stake. He made his way to the corral, behind the bank where the gang's horses were kept. Two guards, their attention on the streets, never saw him coming. He opened the gate and spooked the horses, sending them scattering into the night. Now Thorne's men were afoot. Trapped Thorne was beginning to crack. Silas could see him pacing the hotel balcony, his gestures sharp with frustration. How can one man turn a simple operation into a disaster? He shouted, it was then that Lieutenant Morrison's nerve broke. Because he's not just any man, Colonel, his voice carried in the night air. He's the ghost of Chancellorsville. And maybe we're the ones in the wrong. Thorne summoned Morrison to his quarters. Silas knew what it meant. He reached the hotel's second floor, just as Thorne was about to execute the young lieutenant for his descent. Silas crashed through the window, tackling the colonel. The fight was brutal, a close-quarters struggle between two men who were masters of their violent craft. Silas gained the upper hand, the smoking revolver now in his grasp. He gave Morrison a choice: follow a madman or help save the people in the church. Morrison, his face a mask of confusion and fear, chose the town. He went to the window to call for his men to stand down. But the remaining outlaws, trapped and desperate, responded with a hail of gunfire. The siege of Cedar Ridge was about to begin in earnest. The battle for the hotel raged for an hour. Room by room, Silas fought through the assault, his experience and calm precision a deadly counter to the outlaws' desperate fury. By the time the sun began to crest the eastern mountains, 5 more outlaws lay dead. But Silas was down to his last handful of cartridges. The remaining 4 outlaws had withdrawn, consolidating their position at the church. The gunfight in the street, started by Morrison's plea, had ended with the young lieutenant bleeding in the dust and the outlaws more entrenched than ever. They knew their leader was captured, their escape route gone. They had nothing to lose. Silas knew he had to end it, and end it now. He left the hotel, a ghost in the morning light, and made his way to Odin. "Hello, old friend," Silas murmured. "Are you ready for one more fight?" The war horse responded, lowering his head for the specialized bridle. Man and horse moved as one, a single entity of purpose and skill. They approached from the west, using the rising sun to mask their approach. The first outlaw died without ever seeing death coming. The second fell 30 seconds later. The third, using hostages as a shield, was taken down by an impossible shot from 70 yards away, a testament to Silas's skill and Odin's steadiness. That left 2, barricaded inside the sanctuary. "McKenna," a voice roared from inside. "This is Sergeant Blake. We've got women and children. Safe passage, or they start dying." It was a lie. Men like Blake didn't leave witnesses. "Blake!" "I'm coming in, unarmed," Silas shouted, dropping his weapons. "It's a trap," Thorne yelled from the hotel window. But Silas was already moving up the church steps, hands raised. The doors opened, and Blake appeared, revolver trained on Silas's chest. "That's far enough, Ghost," Blake said. "Dead heroes don't testify." "I know," Silas replied calmly. "That's why I didn't come alone." The church's stained glass windows exploded inward as Odin came through them like a battering ram, charging down the center aisle. Blake spun toward the new threat. It was enough. Silas dove, tackling the outlaw. As they wrestled, Sheriff Brody, who had been among the hostages, lunged and took down the other outlaw, Corporal Davis. The fight was over. Silence fell over the sanctuary. Then, slowly, the people of Cedar Ridge began to realize their nightmare had ended. And in the middle of it all stood Silas McKenna. The man they'd called a traitor. Sheriff Brody was the first to approach. "McKenna," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I owe you an apology." "We all do." Silas didn't stay for the adulation. He led Odin out of the ruined church and mounted up. As he prepared to ride back to his ranch, Brody approached one last time. "The town council met. They want to make you an honorary marshal." Silas looked back at the town coming back to life. "I appreciate the offer, Sheriff, but I think I'll stick to ranching. It's quieter work." He touched the brim of his hat and turned Odin toward home. The people of Cedar Ridge watched him go, not with whispers, but with a quiet, profound respect. That evening, he sat on his porch with a glass of whiskey. The silence felt companionable rather than oppressive. Odin stood in the near pasture, content. The weight Silas had carried for 8 years had finally begun to lift. He had found his redemption, not in their approval, but in his own actions. The war was finally over. He was free.